Good morning, good day, and good evening to all our attendees joining us for today's latest Data Science Central webinar. I would like to start today by thanking Tableau Software for sponsoring today's event. As many of you may know, Tableau is a wonderful supporter of the Data Science Central community, and we are honored to have them sponsoring our event today. I would also like to take this opportunity to mention and show appreciation for some of our other recent sponsors, including Actuate, Teradata, Tibco, Pivotal, Hortonworks, and VoltDB, to name just a few. These past webinars are available on demand at datasciencecentral.com, and if you have not had the opportunity to view them, I would encourage you to do so. Today's webinar is entitled Visual Storytelling in the Age of Data. And before we begin, I'd like to briefly review the format for today's webinar. Today's event will be 1 hour long. We have a single panelist that I'll introduce to all of you in just a few moments. We should have about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A following the presentation, and this event is being taped and will be made available later on this afternoon at datasciencecentral.com. I would also like to encourage our attendees to provide questions throughout the presentation. We will review them and present them on your behalf during the Q&A portion of today's event. My name is Tim Madison. I'm one of the co-founders of Data Science Central, and I will be your host for today's event. I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Robert Kosara of Tableau Software. Robert is a research scientist at Tableau and formerly Associate Professor of Computer Science at UNC Charlotte. He has created visualization techniques like parallel sets and performed research into the perceptual and cognitive basics of visualization. Recently, Robert's research has focused on how to communicate data using tools from visualization and how storytelling can be adapted to incorporate data, interaction, and visualization. He received his Master's in Science and PhD degrees in Computer Science from the Vienna University of Technology. Thank you for joining us this morning, Robert.
Thanks for having me.
Facts that are reported in the media are increasingly based on numbers. These lend themselves not only to visualization, but also to exploration by the readers. Creating compelling stories around data is not an easy task, and there is the danger of simply creating a visualization that leaves all the work to the reader. In today's webinar, you will see a variety of examples of great visual storytelling done in the news media like the New York Times and the Washington Post, and look at some of the strategies used by journalists as well as how visualization research might affect their work in the future. The goal is to build a bridge between the usually disconnected worlds of visual analysis and visual communication, and to figure out how the two can benefit each other. So Robert, with that, I'm going to leave the floor to you, and you can begin whenever you're ready.
Thank you. So good morning and good afternoon, I guess, everybody. My goal here is to talk a little bit about how we can present information and how we can use visualization to tell a story about some data. And this is something that is a fairly new thing in some ways. It's also something that has actually been done for quite a while. And I'm going to show you a few examples that are at least from earlier, from last century, I guess. But in the visualization field and in business intelligence, we've mostly focused on analysis. And so what I want to do is I want to show you a little bit how we can, what examples there are out there for presentation and for storytelling, and then also how we can use some of the ideas that have been developed for analysis can actually inform the storytelling side and can help us build better stories. Just to kind of establish my street cred here, so I'm a research scientist, and as a scientist I write papers. And so we had a paper, Chuck McKinley and I, in IEEE Computer last year that is called Storytelling, the Next Step for Visualization. This is an IEEE publication that is more of a magazine-style journal, and so this article talks a little bit about different scenarios that are there and different kinds of ways you might be using storytelling in different kinds of scenarios, which I will also talk about today in this presentation. So when we talk about data visualization and business intelligence and the way we analyze data, we often talk about visualizations like this one, like a bar chart. This shows the amount of money that was spent on elections in the U.S. in the 70s and early 80s. And this is a bar chart just like any other. This was built in Tableau, but you can build this obviously in any other tool. And I can add a title or a description to this. First of all, to say, what is this? Well, this is total House and Senate campaign expenditures in millions of dollars. And it tells you something about what it is. And I can even give it a crisper title. I can say that these costs are monstrous, right? So these costs have been increasing a lot. But it's still not nearly as impressive as using something a bit more obvious, like this monster here, that tells you something about what the creator of this graphic, Nigel Holmes, was thinking about these costs and the rising costs. This is still kind of a bar chart. The teeth here are like bars, and there are lots of problems, of course. If you were to show this to Edward Tufte, he would tell you that the baseline isn't level anymore. It's not straight, the bars, because they aren't rectangles. They're distorted. There's a lot of chart chunk here. There's a monster, and there are lots of little things here, like you can see the tail of the monster that looks like a $. There's a vote button and so on. These are all things that you don't need to get the data across, but they do help you understand what this actually is about. And that is really something that stories, or that makes this much more of a story than a simple visualization. And in visualization, very often we look at something like this. This is kind of the raw material where we start. And this is very useful for analysis because this is where you can do whatever you want with it. And I'm going to show you a few things that you can do with this particular data a little later on. But this is not a story. This doesn't actually tell you what it's about, and it doesn't lead you through. There is kind of a middle ground. Here's an example that is called the isotype, or this kind of technique is called isotype, which is sort of language that was developed in the 1920s, 1930s by Otto Neurath and Gerhard Arndt to tell people something about the world based on numbers. And this is really interesting because the techniques are fairly simple, but they're quite powerful in telling you what the data is and also making it quite readable. This particular example essentially tells you the story of the Industrial Revolution in England in the 19th century. The little figures that you see here are weavers working either at home or in the factory. So the red ones are working in the factory, and the little arrow or the little box that you can see are a particular percent of factories, and there's a smokestack there to kind of drive the point home. But the point is that you can see how, and there's a timeline going from the top to the bottom, and you can see how starting in the 1820s or 1830s, the number of weavers who were working in factories started to increase very quickly until essentially all the weavers were working in factories. And you can also see the overall number, which is represented usually each figure represents 10,000 workers. So that you can actually, if you count the figures, you can actually tell the actual number. But you can also read this as kind of a bar chart. So the width of the line, the length of the bars represents the number at least to a multiple of 10,000. And the little blue things there are the amount of product that was produced. So you can see that the production was increasing quite a bit over time. And what was interesting here is that you can actually understand what this is about. You can see this is about people. You can also read it fairly easily as a timeline, and you can read the numbers. So you can read roughly the number, or the development of the numbers over time from this, and get a lot more context from it than you would get from a simple bar chart or a simple line chart. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is the way to go for every story, but this is an interesting data point here. And it's also interesting to see that this is actually recently old, so this is almost 100 years old now. And similar things were actually done before that, so the presentation is actually probably the older one of the tasks in visualization as compared to now. Now, stories are interesting because when you talk to people about them, you sometimes get this response that people feel like they're going to be led astray, or that you will lie to them because you're telling a story. Perhaps you're not telling them the truth, or maybe you're trying to lead them somewhere where they don't necessarily want to go, which is obviously a concern that I can understand, but also I think it's a bit overblown because you can always misrepresent your data and tell people the wrong things. You don't necessarily need to tell a story about them. But I think you will see in the next couple of examples that story is actually really useful and really powerful to help you understand data and to get data across when you present it to somebody else, when you present essentially your results to somebody else. So what I'm going to do is I will talk about essentially a model of how I see the kind of the storytelling space. And I'm going to do this using a simple kind of two-dimensional layout here with two axes. There is one axis here that basically is about whether something tells a story or not. And the other one is what I call story depth. How deep is it in the sense of how much can you get out of it? And my first example that you already saw is this bar chart. That bar chart is a very simple chart here. It doesn't tell you a story. It just represents the data. And but this is a simple chart. And that is basically my lower left part here, which is it's not very deep because you can only read so many numbers from it, but it does tell, and it doesn't tell you a story by itself. You have to work on it. The other example was the more information graphics type thing, like my monster, which tells you more of a story, but of course it also has very limited depth. You can only see so much in those teeth that you see there. And those are the classic examples for more storytelling related things. And then there's visualization. And visualization is useful and great because it's very deep. You can do a lot with it. You can interact with it. You can build all kinds of things with it. But it doesn't tell you the story by itself. And so I think it needs help. And then there's this top right quadrant, which I'll get to at the end, which I think is where we want to go to have something that tells a story but also has enough depth. And I will talk a bit more about that at the very end. And so as I'm going to talk about four different ideas that help you push you along those axes. So I'm going to try and go to the right and up here essentially, from the simple charts and from visualizations to the right, and from the infographics and the simple charts up to more depth. And the first one I'm going to talk about is narrative. The first, kind of the obvious first thing you need when you tell a story is you need to add narrative to something. And I'm going to talk about some simple strategies here that do that. Here's a visualization of sorts, or a graphic that was done by Jonathan Corum for the New York Times. And what it actually is, what it's depicting isn't so important, but the structure is really interesting, which is that there are three individual images, and you can read those, and you essentially, if I had shown this to you and asked you, what do you see, you would have told me that there are three steps, and there's time passing from left to right here, very likely. And that is actually what is happening. This is a representation here of how water rates, how rivers are changing over time, how they're being dammed up, and so on. But the details of this aren't as important as the structure of it, which is you can read this left to right because you're used to doing that, and you can understand time as being represented here, even though there is no sequence that's obvious. At least that it's not presented to you in sequence, but you can read it as a sequence. Another example that you may have seen before, this is Minard's famous Napoleon's March chart, or graphic. It's very similar in that there is a progression from left to right here. If you haven't seen this before, there's this tan-lined ribbon that's going from west to east, from left to right. It starts on the left in a place called Kovno in Lithuania, and it goes to Moscow on the right side. And I forgot to say what this actually is about. So this represents the number of soldiers in Napoleon's army in Napoleon's what's called Napoleon's Russian campaign in 1812 and 1813. And what it shows you by the width of that ribbon, of that line, is the number of soldiers. So he starts out on the left there with 400,000 men, and he ends up in Moscow with 100,000. So he's lost 3/4 of his men, turns around, and then the black line is going back, and he goes from 100,000 in Moscow back to about 10,000 at the end. So this is what this represents, and I don't want to dwell on the data. There's a lot of interesting information here, but the technique is interesting because it's so simple. and so readable and so elegant in how you can just read this as a story. It's a bit like a road trip where you have time passing left to right, and you can read that because there is this kind of inherent left to right kind of sequence. This is probably the more common way you know this. I just removed some of the pieces from it to make it a bit more obvious what's the kind of the progression here. There's also a bit more information at the bottom here, which I want to skip over here for now. A similar idea has been used in the news, in news graphics, and I'm going to show you a few examples from different newspapers and news media. This particular one is called the Connected Scatterplot. This is a graphic that was done by Hannah Fairfield for the New York Times 2 years ago, a year and a half ago. And what it represents is the number of car fatalities in the U.S. over time. But the way it's done is quite interesting. It's essentially a scatter plot. There is a vertical axis, which is the number of fatalities per 100,000 people. And there's an x-axis, a horizontal axis, that shows you the number of miles driven, also per population. And so what you would get with that in a scatter plot would be just disconnected points. But what they've done is they've connected those points in sequence over time, starting in 1950 and then going through time here into the 1970s and then the 1980s all the way to basically to now. And what happens here is that this line traces a very interesting pattern, and you can see certain times, certain events, when certain things happened. Like, for example, laws were passed or new types of cars were introduced and so on. And you can follow this line, and there are little things happening, like this loop, for example, when during the oil crisis, when people were driving less, because overall there's, of course, an increase in miles driven on the x-axis, but it's not a time axis, so it can actually go back on itself and loop back, like you can see there. And what this does is it essentially takes you along a little journey. You can see where it starts. There are little arrows in there as well that tell you which way to go, and you can follow that. And it gives you a very interesting layout and a very interesting way of looking at this whole story, and it invites you to actually follow it and to read this as a story through time. So again, this is the narrative portion here, the sequence that takes you through something that, in this case, is pretty much a very linear sequence. You can also use this to talk through an argument or a sequence of different ways of looking at data. This is an example from the Washington Post from last year, where they looked at the contributions made by the NRA to different politicians, different members of Congress and senators. And what they did was quite interesting. They looked at the contributions by breaking down the people, in this case the data, essentially, in different ways. So you can be looking at Democrats versus Republicans using the obvious colors, and then they also had one where they broke it down. Then they added the amounts. You can see who got more, who got less by looking at the size of the bubbles. This is only showing you those senators and members of Congress who received any money at all from the NRA. And so this is now, again, by political party, and then they broke it down by the winners and the losers of the 2012 elections, and and you can see who there got money and who did not, and then they broke it down by House and Senate, and also the parties and so on. So you can get a feeling for kind of different steps or different ways of looking at the data. There isn't really a narrative here. One thing doesn't necessarily follow from the other, but it takes you through this kind of argument and this kind of way of looking at the data, and that way develops a story over time. And so I want to show you a little example also of how we do this, or how we are building tools to do this in Tableau. And switch over here to the other program. And because of building a new feature that will be released in Tableau 8.2, which is called story points. I want to demonstrate this very briefly. This is very strongly based on this idea of building a narrative. So what you see here is a story. This is a slightly outdated prototype, but it's going to show you the idea of how this works. And we're currently refining it, and this 8.2, Tableau 8.2 will be released sometime in the first half of this year. What this does is it gives you this navigator at the top there that lets you walk through a story. So I can see these points there at the top that are different steps in my story, and at the bottom or in the lower 2/3 or so is a dashboard, just like Tableau already lets you build. But in this particular case, the story is based on data that was published by the Centers on Medicare and Medicaid in April or so last year that looked at the different costs for different procedures in essentially all of the hospitals across the country. And what we're looking at here is the cost for particular types of treatments or problems in different hospitals. So you can see here that there's and the x-axis here is the amount. So you can see that there's a huge range here for the same kind of procedure or the same kind of problem between the lowest cost and the highest cost. There's actually a factor of 7 or more than 7 between those two. There's and so I can look at this and say, well, there's a cost here that can vary quite a bit. And I could look at this and say, well, maybe this is between different parts of the country. So I can filter, and this is my next step here is to introduce a filter and say, well, maybe this is if I only look at, for example, the western part of the country, things don't vary as much, but it turns out they actually still do. So they vary even within hospitals just in the west. And this is one of my insights here. Or maybe I can look at a different way of looking at this. For example, looking at a map and looking at variations per state. What you're seeing here is the color represents the difference between the lowest and the highest cost, again, for the breathing problem within each state. And you can see that there's a clear outlier here, which is California. And you can also see some of the states having more or less differences within the state. And then I can look at a more local picture, and if you saw any of the stories that came out around that time when this data was released last year, there were these examples of hospitals where only blocks apart and that charge very different amounts for the same kind of procedure. This is looking at San Francisco here, and you can see 2 different hospitals that where one charges more than twice what the other one charges, and they're only about 2 miles apart. And of course, I'm not trying to explain here or trying to point fingers here that there are reasons for this. One of these is a university hospital, and they give the much more complicated cases. But you can see that there are interesting structures in this data. And of course, I could say, well, maybe this is just a problem on the West Coast or in San Francisco. Let's look at the East Coast. And here's what I want to show. This isn't the New York area. And what I want to show you here is one of the big things here is not just that you can build the story itself in Tableau, but you still are in Tableau when you're presenting, like I am right now. So I can make changes, or I can add something to it. For example, I could say, well, you can see here there's this one, the red or this orange one, orange here meaning high, cost in Manhattan, and just across the river here in Brooklyn, there's another one that has a much lower cost. Maybe I want to point that out and add that to my story. I can just interact here by selecting these 2 guys. And then at the top here, I get a new story point. And I can now add a new point to my story and say, well, Manhattan is more expensive than Brooklyn. And capture that point. And now I have created a new point in my story that now when I present the story, it will be part of that narrative, of that sequence. And I've done this by simply making changes and capturing those and creating a new point in my story. So the narrative, I think, is certainly one of the most important and perhaps the most important things in stories and in storytelling. And by building better tools, we can make it easier for people to actually build those stories and tell stories that they want to tell people. Sorry, I'm switching back here from the screen sharing, and I was lost here for a second. The narrative is an incredibly important part of storytelling, and it basically is that part, that component that leads you through the story, that really turns something into a story. But it's not the only one. there's something more to it than that, but we can also talk about this later in the discussion. There's also the question of story depth. So how do we add more depth to the stories? And one of the ways, or to the presentation, one of the ways of doing that is to add more data, and this is where we go into this more story depth thing. Here is a scatter plot. This is my favorite scatter plot that was done by Hannah Fairfield for the New York Times about 2 years ago, I believe. That talks about the wage gap between men and women. What this does is it shows you the amount of money men and women make on the different axes. So the horizontal axis here is men's median earnings, and the vertical axis is women's median earnings. And it's broken down by a large number of professions. And the idea is that in a simple scatter plot, and I'm going to show you the simple naked scatter plot a little later. If you were to just do this in a simple scatter plot, it would be very difficult for you to see where the equal line is, where men and women here make the same amount of money. So what they've done here, which is extremely smart, extremely simple, but extremely smart, is they added this thick line, which is the equal wage line. So any point that's to the top left of that line means women are making more than men, and any point that's to the lower right of that means that men are making more than women. And you can see that there are more points, of course, in the lower right here. And the second element to this is that they've added these additional lines below the heavy line, which would show you 10% less, 20% less, and 30% less for women than for men. And that's also very, very useful and very smart, because it lets you judge the amount that women are making less than, or the percentage that women are making less than men, to less than 10%, which you wouldn't be able to do with a simple scatter plot. Now, what I've tried to do is I wanted to know if there's more that we can do with this. So actually, I think I have a few steps here. So what they did was they also let you walk through separate points here. So this is going back to my narrative argument from earlier. You can use these filters on the top left there to filter the data down to particular groups of professions, and then they point out certain points or certain interesting reasons why these points are. Some of those points are outliers, and some of them are simply ones that they point out because they think they're interesting, and to kind of explain what the data is and to give you a bit more of context here for what these things, what this data really tells you. But in addition to that, I was wondering, how does this compare over time? And I wanted to add some more data to it. So I did this. I looked at some of the data, and I got this data back to about 2007 or so, and recreated this in Tableau. And you can do most of this in Tableau. I actually have a little trick here that's something that you can't do, but most of this is actually done in Tableau. And I added this additional plot on the lower right, which is a line chart over time. And so what I tried to do here was to basically find patterns. And those patterns aren't super exciting because it's not a very long time period. So if this was going back to the 1980s or the 1960s, it would be much more interesting. But I was looking at development over time for how different professions have done. And you can see some of these patterns here actually emerging. And I will show you another example of patterns like that a little bit later. But my point here being that you can add, once you have a good basis for a story or a good basis for a presentation, you can add to it, and you can build much more powerful additional views that can be really, really useful and really add much to the presentation. I have a different example here that's using the Case-Shiller home price index over time. This is measuring how housing prices have changed over about 13 years in this case in 20 cities across the U.S. And there's also an overall index that basically summarizes them all together into one index. But this was done by the New York Times, and it's a very nice exploratory little example. It lets you look at your city, or you can look at the lines and kind of see which one's the highest, which one's the lowest. But I felt that there's more to it that could have been done here to kind of explore it more effectively. So I got the data and I rebuilt this in Tableau, and this is the overall home price index. This is the composite for 20 cities. And you can break this down into the cities. And then you get, actually hit the button here, you will see that. You now get this very colorful image of all the different cities at the same time, and this looks very much like the one we just saw before. But I was wondering, what are the different shapes here? Like, what is there that I can see here that to kind of look at what kind of shapes are there? Because I see lots of lines, but it's really hard to see how many different shapes there really are. And so I added something here that's called small multiples, which is an idea from the data visualization field, where I broke down, in addition to having the overall chart, I have these little charts on the side there that show me each individual city as a small line, basically a simple, almost like an icon. And I can't see a lot of detail there, but what I can see is the overall pattern. And that's what I'm interested in. So for example, I can point to one of those patterns, like the one here. This is Miami. This is the highest one, the biggest bubble we had was in Miami, and I can see that there are a couple that look like that one. And I can see also which ones are earlier, which one happened later, and so on. I can look at the ones that are flat, like in this case, this is Detroit, and how it didn't have much of a bubble, and then it even dropped quite a bit below the baseline. The baseline here, by the way, being 2000, January 2000. So everything here is indexed to January 2000. So all the points start at the same value here because of that. And then there are more, like for example, this is Phoenix, and you can see here that there is this bubble, which is a pretty big bubble, but it's not as huge as Miami. And then it drops down, then there's a recovery, then it drops back down, and then it starts to recover again. And so you can see these different kind of patterns where you can see some recovery, you can see them going back and forth, and so on, and get some more data from it. There's also another interesting part to this that goes kind of in a different direction, different dimension, which is I looked at this, when I downloaded this data, it turns out that there isn't just 13 years of data here, starting in 2000, but it actually goes back another 13 years. And so I added that to it, and now you can see something very interesting. Going back to 1987, you can see that compared to the 13 years before 2000, that bubble was just huge. It's just way larger than anything that had happened the previous 13 years. You can get a sense of just how big that bubble was and how much how unusual it was, at least compared to that time period. So adding more data, I think, is a very, very powerful way of giving people more information. And this can be done, depending on how it's done, I think this can be very powerful, but it obviously can also be dangerous because you might be overloading your presentation. And that's actually my next point, which is that a key issue and a key mistake that people make is that they don't focus their stories. There's a big difference between analysis and presentation. When you analyze data, you want to have it all in front of you. You want to look at lots and lots of different data. But when you present, when you tell a story, you want to focus. And I'm going to show you an example here. When you look at the Wikipedia page for Napoleon's Russian campaign, there's somebody who built these two maps here that represent a good part of what happened. So what you see here is this map that has the big red part here is Russia. This is in the early 1800s. The blue lines, the blue arrows here are the French forces. The red lines and the red arrows are the Russians. The red areas that you see there are battles. If you look closer, you can see names of generals and field marshals and so on. And of course, there were lots and lots of men here, mostly men, I guess, fighting, 400,000 on the French side, about twice as many on the Russian side, and untold civilians, of course. And this tells you a lot more about, what went on there. And this is just the first part of it. This is the French advancing towards Moscow. And then the second one here, which is the French retreating from Moscow, and there's a lot of interesting military history here if you're into this, and you can get a lot of information here. And this is analysis, but it's just not a story. This does not present itself as a story. Now this is a story. And what Minard did was he did this about 30 years after the actual war. But what he did was he was really smart about reducing the amount of information that he had, because he had quite a bit of information about what had gone on. and reducing that to essentially a single number over time and presenting just that. And that's what makes it so compelling, because it makes it much, much easier to follow and to see what was happening, and actually to read this as a story rather than reading it as lots and lots and lots of information that just doesn't have a simple narrative through it. Now, going back to my scatterplot I showed you earlier about the wage gap, I tried this. As I said, I rebuilt this in Tableau, and I tried to figure out how to reduce that to the minimum amount of information that we need to show to make this work. So this is now the same data that you just saw without the additional lines. And as you can perhaps tell, it's really hard to actually see where the diagonal is. And if I had showed you this before without telling you anything about it, you would have drawn a line here that's more of a that kind of would cut through all the data rather than really be the actual diagonal. And so I was wondering, how can I make this work with the minimal amount of information that I'm adding? What I did here was I just added this shaded area, which does the same, or has the same purpose as the line we saw earlier, that differentiates the two halves of the data. So now it shows me in gray is where or in the gray area are the points where men are making more money, and in the white part, the women are making more. This, I argue, is the minimal amount of additional information you need here. Of course, that's easy for me to say because I've seen the other one, but that's basically the most focused part. Now I can add something to it. So I can add the lines, and those lines are obviously useful because the additional, well, that's the main diagonal, which I could have left out here, but the additional lines are really useful because they let me read it to a much higher precision. And then I can add more. Like, for example, I can now add the colors, which I argue are actually a distraction. And again, this is me criticizing something here that really works really well. But the point here is that the colors aren't strictly necessary. So I could have actually left those out entirely and just presented the filters and then have you filter later, or just show those later and build it up like that. Now I can add my timeline again, and then use that to filter or to select and highlight between the two. But the point is that it's a very interesting exercise to go to your dashboards and to go to your visualizations and look at and just try and remove everything that you can, while still telling or making a point or telling the main story. And you're going to learn quite a bit actually from that. It's a very interesting, useful way to spend some time, maybe an hour, looking at your dashboards and trying to figure out, so I can do all these things on my dashboard. What do I really need if I want to present this? How many steps am I going to do, and what are the key points? And reducing the information that you have on there and making it simpler, and that way very often making it easier for people to comprehend. That's part about focus. And then my last part is taking another idea from data visualization, or actually from human-computer interaction, which is called information scent. This is an idea that was started with the idea of something that's called a scented widget, where which you may have seen if you do a search, for example, in I think in Chrome and also like in Word. If you search, it shows you in the document, it shows you on the scroll bar where the hits are, where your word has been found. So you can basically scroll there very quickly, and that gives you a sense of where you will find information. So you can kind of follow that scent of information. And that is a very powerful idea that I think we can actually adapt for visualization. This is an example here that I can't show you right now how it works, but I'm just going to describe briefly how this is done. This is a visualization that was done by the New York Times, Amanda Cox and colleagues a few years ago, 4 years ago or so now, that shows you the unemployment rate for overall. So you can see that the main visualization here has this blue line, which is the overall unemployment rate. And you can see that there are all these additional lines there in the background. And when you mouse over, you can actually see that respond. You can see it highlights one of those lines that you're over, and it shows you who those people are. So it breaks that data down from the overall average down to a group, for example, and this is based on demographics. So this is by race, by age group, by gender, and by education. And so when you mouse over, you can explore those. You can look at which ones are high, which ones are low. You can click on them, and then it selects that particular line. And it also, at the top there, you can see those filters. It then selects those filters. And so that way it kind of tells you that there is something more you can do here. And so you can then start looking at the filters and click through those, and it shows you what those are, what the corresponding lines are at the bottom. And so it leads you into the data in a way that's very effective because it's not very, it's partly because it's just not trying to say, well, click here, click there, that kind of leads you into that. So I was trying to build something similar by looking at slightly different data. This is also unemployment data, but it's broken down in a different way. This is the overall unemployment rate for a longer time period. This is from 2000 to 2012, or 2013 rather. And the way I've broken it down here is by MSA, by a metropolitan area. This is I think it's I forget what the S stands for, but this is a way that the census breaks the country down into these large metropolitan areas, and then uses those to kind of measure things like unemployment rate. So when you look at this, it's a big mess, lots of lines here, and when you look at this for a while, you start seeing patterns, and that's where I'm trying to get to. Is I want to show you some of those patterns, and then kind of lead you into the visualization. So here, my first step here is to look at the outliers. These are 3 metro areas that have particularly high unemployment rate and have had those for a long time. They've almost always been the highest ones. And it's interesting to look at which ones those are. So one of them is Puerto Rico, and the 2 others are in California and Arizona, but they're actually very close together. They're both on the border with Mexico, and they're not very far apart. It's kind of interesting to see that area in particular is so extremely high and so much higher than any other area in the country. So this is one part. This is outliers. They're kind of obvious, and they're interesting to look at. And then there's another spike here, or another pattern here, which is a big spike. This is in 2006. There's a huge spike for a number of these metro areas. And if you remember what happened in 2006, you might be able to guess what this was, and especially if I show you which areas this were. So this is all in Mississippi and Louisiana. This was Hurricane Katrina that caused a lot of unemployment in those areas that were the most hit by the hurricane. And then there's another little spike, or well, it's smaller than the one I just showed you, but it's also kind of an interesting spike here. This is later in 2008, and it's only a small number of metro areas. And you might be able to guess what this was just from the timing, and maybe if you know your way around the auto industry better than I do, you would have also guessed from these place names. But this is largely auto industry, so these are places that were hit by different car companies and parts manufacturers being hit by the financial crisis. So what I just did was I walked you through a number of parts, or a number of subsets of this data, going from this to something that is much more interesting, much more approachable, because I've pointed out a few pieces like this. So in this example now, you could use this as a starting point to give this to somebody and say, here's the data. I've already pointed out a few things that I think are interesting, but you can still explore, because we're still talking about doing this, of course, not in PowerPoint, but in a presentation program. You can interact, you can find your own things. You can look at maybe the lowest values here, which metro areas have the lowest unemployment rates and so on. So you can find all kinds of interesting things. You don't have to just take my word or my results. You can use the tool to dig deeper and find your own stories, find your own insights. That's the idea of information center. I think it's actually a very powerful one that can be extremely useful and helpful to add more depth to a story and to add more to a presentation. And so I've given this presentation a few times, and the interesting thing is that somebody at some point pointed out to me that, it's actually interesting that there are two dimensions here, and you talk about all these information sent and focus and these kinds of things, but it's also about things that the author does versus things that the viewer does or the audience does. So these two axes are actually ones where one is more of an authoring thing where you can add more to it, and you have to be the one as the author. You have to be the one to focus and to make sure that there's a narrative and so on. But the other dimension is actually much more about interaction. It's about what the audience can do with the story once you've published it and so on. And so now to talk about this top right part there, this is basically where I think we're heading, even though we're doing this very slowly, into something that I call visual data stories. And I don't have an example for one that I really think is perfect, that really embodies the entire idea of what I believe we could do. But taking all of the things that I just talked about and putting them together and kind of figuring out a way to kind of take the best ideas from all of them, and actually some of them I haven't even shown you, but taking all these ideas and kind of combining them and compressing them into one, that's kind of where I think we're heading. And I think that is really what will make visual storytelling extremely powerful, is because we will have a way of taking ideas from storytelling, from presentation, and from visualization, and kind of moving all the things that we're already doing towards that upper right and making that extremely powerful, extremely compelling as a way to tell stories, for people to remember the points of stories, and to understand data and the context of the data much better than they do right now. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Great. Thank you, Robert. That was a really wonderful presentation. And we have had a lot of questions coming in from our audience. So let me advance the slide here so everyone can have your contact information. So thank you again to our audience for providing some great questions. We'll try to get through as many as we can with the time remaining. During this time, I just want to make everyone aware that Robert's information is on the current slide. You can take his email address down if you have additional questions or would like to reach out to him after today's event. So let me start with the first question. I think is a really interesting one. The member says, I am a data analyst, a technical expert, and can tell some stories from the data, but I'm not a great storyteller. How can I accomplish this and deliver a great presentation?
That is a very good question, and that's really probably the one that I have the least intelligent things to say about. I'm actually working on this right now in trying to build a kind of a body of examples to use as templates. So some of the ones that I showed you are quite useful for that. I have some more that kind of walk you through a sequence of like an introductory part, and then give you the introduction to the data first, and then there is kind of the main points to be made, and then there's some kind of summary at the end, for example. And there are a few others as well. That is still a bit early, so I'm not sure. And I'm not really prepared to talk about this at this point, but there are certain structures that I've seen kind of repeat in news graphics, even though news graphics don't have this typical story arc where you have beginning, a middle, and an end. And there are the more classic stories that people talk about in movies or in novels and so on. And so I'm trying to condense ideas from those to come up with story structures that work for data. Right now, all I have are some examples that I think work well and that can be used as starting points. But that's a good question. That's a good research question to figure out how we can come up with those structures and how we can then have certain templates that people can use to start building their stories, even if they don't have much of a background in that area.
Okay. Thank you, Robert. It's one of those things probably practice makes perfect as well. So
absolutely. That too. Yeah, that's for sure.
You become. So another question is, How do the layering or graphical capabilities in R compare to those in Tableau?
I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer that. I don't know I believe this is a question about the ggplot library that is built on the grammar of graphics, and that is similar in some respects, but also different in some other respects to Tableau. So I don't know specifically for the layering. I can't say. There are things that you can do in R that you can't do in Tableau, even though Tableau certainly has a lot of features that we've built recently, like the box plot that it can do. But it's certainly much easier to build these things in Tableau. So in Tableau, you just talk directly to the database. You do everything graphically, whereas in R, you have to write the expression to do it. I don't know about the layering in particular, so that's not a question I can answer. But I'm happy to follow up if you can email me, and I can talk to the people who know more about layering in particular.
Okay, and yeah, for that viewer that asked that question, we'll get additional details for you later on. Another question is, what is the difference between data visualization and data discovery? And they're asking if you can give some examples as well.
So discovery is a part of visualization. So in the classic kind of literature in data visualization, there are three steps or three phases that people usually talk about. One is called exploration, and that is basically discovery. Then there's analysis, and then there's presentation. And so what I just talked about is essentially presentation. And presentation hasn't really been covered much in the actual academic literature, but most of the focus has been on exploration or discovery and analysis. And so the idea in discovery is that you start basically by starting to build views from your data because you don't know much about it yet. So you're basically building all those views to see what's in that data, and then you can start building hypotheses about what you might be able to find in there, and then go into the analysis from there to start testing your hypotheses. And so discovery is certainly a part of that. An example, an example could be that one that I showed earlier was the unemployment data, where I had, I don't know if I can switch here briefly to my slides here. So if you remember my line chart, this is essentially what you get as your first discovery thing. So I opened this data set, and this is what I got. This is data over time. And now the discovery is to start and select parts of it and try to figure out what they are, how they're different than the other data, and dig into the data and try to find what are interesting patterns, like the ones that I showed later. That those are the little colorful ones, those different structures that then kind of emerge from that exploration phase, from the discovery phase.
Very good. Okay. Another question is, does it make sense to build prescriptive analytics in your visualizations? And I guess, so they actually provide so what corrective steps do we need to take having seen this data? Does that make sense to you?
So I'm guessing the question is about guided analytics. Is that?
Yeah, I'm not sure. So let's move on to a different question.
No, but that's fine. So I think that that's an interesting question for storytelling, because there is a difference between presentation, like I'm talking, and I'm presenting, or I'm talking in front of an audience, and they can ask me questions, but I'm basically the one talk. So there is a presenter, versus a different scenario where I'm giving you something to explore, which is actually much more the news graphic type of thing. And I want you to walk through it and to explore it yourself, but I'm guiding you. So in some news graphics, there isn't much you can actually explore. You can just click through. But in some, there's more to it. You can actually dig deeper yourself. And so there's an interesting tension there between trying to essentially prescribe the entire story on the one end, and making it entirely making the whole process purely exploratory. And I think that if you really want to tell a story, you have to have a strong narrative component to it. So you have to guide people. but you want to leave it open, or you want to have points where people can dig in and ask their own questions. And that is something that you can do in an interactive presentation, of course, especially when you're doing things like I was trying to show earlier with the story points demo. If you're using the actual visualization tool rather than a presentation tool, then you can actually ask questions. So if I'm showing something and somebody asks a question, I can do filtering. I can add, I can mouse over something and see, oh, that's that point, and so on. So there's more of that, but I'm still guiding the presentations. But that's an interesting question because this is very much open questions about what kinds of how much narrative there should be or how much guidance there should be, and that's still up for debate, I'm sure.
Very good. And there's a couple of questions that came in that I think join nicely to that and your explanation, and it's really about the amount of data used in the visualization. So one of the questions is it a good idea to use 4 axes of information? And connected to that, is there a danger of introducing a lot of, quote, junk or really too much information into a visualization when telling a story?
Yeah, absolutely. So that is a good question. This is the big tension here, and I think why people sometimes are a bit reluctant to do the storytelling part because they want to essentially follow the advice of Everett Tuskey and Stephen Few to reduce the visualization to its absolute bare minimum. And I think there's a value in that, especially in analysis, because there's no point in adding anything to the visualization while you're analyzing it. But when it comes to presentation, your goals are different. You want to present something to your peers, to your superiors, and you want them to take away a message. You want to get something across that they remember. And that is not something you care about in analysis. In fact, you don't actually want that because in analysis, you're just basically working with the data. But in presentation, the goal is now to get something across. And there, I think you need to make things that stand out more. Because if you show people, 100 bar charts, they're not going to remember a particular bar chart from that set. You need to have something that's a bit more compelling and where the big thing, the important things stand out more. That can be choice of color, that can be thoughtful and careful additions of graphics. That might be also different unusual techniques that you're using and so on. So there are ways that I think there's a lot of value in exploring a little bit more of the kind of more creative ways of doing data visualization, especially when you're trying to get a point across because you need to really stand out. And that monster I showed you earlier, that's the one you're going to remember from this talk, not the bar chart. Right? So that's the important thing here is that you want things to be unusual, and that's going to make them memorable, and that's going to make them stand out in people's memory.
Yep, very good answer. So this is a question specifically to what is available in terms of your storyboard techniques used in today's presentation. Is that currently available in Tableau? Because they're asking if it's something that's available in Tableau 8.2 or if it's something that they can use in current versions.
Not yet. So there is the current version of Tableau is 8.1. There is a new feature in 8.1 that's called presentation mode. It's actually not a new feature, but it's a vastly improved one. That's the presentation mode where you can use your worksheets. You can go into full screen mode. You can use your worksheets and click through them to present. That's not what I showed you. What I showed you is called story points, and that's coming in 8.2, which is going to be released in the next couple of months. And that is that's the new technique the new feature that lets you build a new type of sheet, which is called a story, and it lets you add worksheets and dashboards to it, and then create and then change them on there and create a story on there. So that's not available yet, but it will be fairly soon. Okay,
very good. So that's going to have to be the last answer and question. Thank you, Robert. Really some great questions from the audience, a lot of participation. So thank you to our audience for all the questions. And I want to make sure everybody is rest assured that these questions will be sent to Robert and to Tableau, and you will get an answer to the question. So I have just a few quick announcements to make. To please mark your calendars for January 21st and our next Data Science Central webinar, which we sponsored by Pivotal. Also, as I mentioned, today's taping will be available later on this afternoon, and you can find it on datasciencecentral.com in the lower right-hand corner in the video section. This brings today's webinar to a close. I'd like to thank our audience again for participating and attending today's event, and a special thank you to Tableau for sponsoring today's event, and to our panelist, Robert Cassar, for his insight into today's topic. My name is Tim Madison. It's been a pleasure to be your host today, and I look forward to seeing you all again on January 21st. Good day.